You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 6,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's dive into today's story. The ancient blade sang against the whetstone in the flickering candlelight, each stroke echoing through the limestone corridors beneath Vatican City. Saturday morning, 5:47 a.m. Alessio Grimaldi had been performing this ritual for 11 years, and the weight of the executioner's sword never grew lighter. He paused mid-stroke, listening to the silence that pressed against him like a living thing. Down here, 300 feet beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the world above might as well have been another planet. No traffic noise penetrated these depths. No human voices, no reminder that millions of people walked and breathed and prayed just overhead. Only the steady drip of condensation from stalactites older than Christianity itself, marking time in a place where time had forgotten to matter. But tonight, something was different. The silence felt expectant, pregnant with possibility. The shadows seemed deeper, more substantial, as if they were gathering strength for some purpose he couldn't fathom. For the first time in 11 years, Alessio felt afraid of what his next assignment might bring. The weapon before him had once belonged to Giovanni Battista Bugatti, the last official papal executioner who served from 1796 to 1864. Bugatti had carried out 514 executions in his career, each one meticulously recorded in Vatican archives that bore his elegant handwriting. The man had been an artist in his profession, capable of separating head from shoulders with a single stroke so clean that witnesses claimed the victim's eyes continued to blink for several seconds afterward. Most believed the position died with Bugatti when the Papal States dissolved in 1870. They were wrong. The Vatican never abolished the role of Maestri di Giustizia. They simply buried it deeper than the catacombs themselves, hidden in layers of bureaucracy and misdirection that would have impressed Byzantine emperors. Alessio had inherited more than just a sword. He'd inherited a legacy of silence, of questions never asked and answers never given. The blade held the weight of centuries, its steel folded and refolded by master smiths who had taken their techniques to the grave. Its edge could part a hair dropped from shoulder height, yet it had never grown dull despite the work it had done in Alessio's hands. The steel itself was wrong in ways that metallurgy couldn't explain. It remained sharp without honing, showed no signs of corrosion despite centuries of exposure to blood and underground moisture, and sometimes seemed to vibrate with its own internal energy. Alessio had learned not to question these anomalies, just as he had learned not to question much about his life in the depths. He set the blade aside and stared at the manuscript before him. Fresh beeswax sealed the papal insignia, still warm to the touch despite the frigid air that perpetually filled these chambers. The seal bore the crossed keys of St. Peter, but beneath them was another mark. Older, more primitive. A spiral that seemed to draw the eye inward, carved with tools that predated Roman steel. Inside lay his next assignment, delivered as always without explanation or context. Just a name, a time, and the weight of centuries pressing down upon his shoulders. But this morning felt different. For the first time in 11 years, Alessio hesitated to break the seal. Perhaps it was the dreams that had plagued him recently. Visions of endless corridors filled with whispers in dead languages, of altars slick with blood that never dried, of eyes watching from shadows that shouldn't exist. The dreams had grown more vivid over the past months, bleeding into his waking hours until He sometimes caught himself listening for voices that shouldn't be there. Or perhaps it was the growing certainty that something was changing in the depths beneath the Vatican, stirring after centuries of slumber. Machines hummed behind walls where no machines should exist. Passages that had been sealed for decades now stood open, revealing chambers that existed on no blueprint. The very stones seemed to pulse with anticipation. The catacombs stretched endlessly around him, carved from living rock by hands that had been dust for 1,000 years. Some passages were works of art, their walls adorned with frescoes depicting the lives of saints and martyrs. Others were purely functional, designed to move bodies and dispose of evidence with ruthless efficiency. All of them led deeper, always deeper, into the earth's hungry embrace. Frescoes depicting medieval exorcisms covered the walls near his workshop, their pigments faded, but their message clear. Here was Cardinal Fortesque casting demons from a possessed nun in 1347, his face twisted with holy fury as otherworldly entities poured from the woman's mouth like smoke. There was Pope Innocent VIII blessing a blade before it separated a heretic's head from his shoulders, the weapon glowing with divine light that left after images in the viewer's vision. The artists had captured every detail with loving precision, the terror in the condemned's eyes as they realized their fate, the righteous fury of the churchmen as they carried out God's justice, the way blood pooled on marble floors, blessed by generations of holy men. Some paintings seemed to move when viewed from the corner of one's eye, figures shifting position when attention was focused elsewhere. One fresco in particular had always disturbed Alessio. It showed a figure in executioner's robes standing before an altar that bore no Christian symbolism, raising a blade towards something that existed in the shadows above. The painting was old, perhaps from the 13th century, but the executioner's face bore an unsettling resemblance to Alessio's own features. He had never mentioned this observation to anyone. Some sins stained the soul so deeply that confession could never wash them clean. That was where Alessio came in, serving as the church's final solution to problems that couldn't be resolved through prayer or penance. Modern executions weren't the public spectacles of centuries past. No crowds gathered in papal squares to witness justice. No vendors sold meat pies and ale to spectators eager for entertainment. Instead, Alessio performed what the Vatican called spiritual exterminations, removing those who dealt in cursed relics, practiced blasphemous rituals, or committed acts that placed their very souls beyond redemption. The condemned came to him in various states. Some were defiant, spitting curses in languages that should have been forgotten centuries ago. Their words carried weight that ordinary profanity lacked, causing candles to flicker and shadows to writhe with independent life. Others were broken, weeping and begging for mercy that would never come, their minds shattered by exposure to truths that human consciousness wasn't designed to process. A few seemed almost relieved when they saw him, as if they had been carrying a burden too heavy for mortal shoulders, and welcomed its removal along with their heads. These were often the most disturbing cases, individuals who had discovered something so terrible that death became a mercy rather than a punishment. But they all shared one thing in common. They had crossed a line that the church could never allow to be uncrossed. They had seen behind the veil that separated the faithful from truths that would destroy faith itself. Alessio descended deeper into the earth, his footsteps echoing off walls that grew older with each level. The first sub-basement contained storage for the Vatican museums, crates of artifacts too dangerous or controversial for public display. Ancient fertility idols carved from human bone that whispered to those who listened too closely. Tablets bearing curses that had toppled empires, their script glowing faintly in darkness. Relics that promised power beyond imagining for a price that seemed reasonable until it came time to pay. He had once opened one of these crates, driven by curiosity that overcame years of training. Inside, wrapped in silk that had turned black with age, was a crown of thorns that predated Christ by centuries. The moment his fingers touched it, visions had flooded his mind, images of rituals performed in chambers that existed beneath the deepest foundations of the Vatican, ceremonies that invoked entities whose names couldn't be spoken by human tongues. The experience had lasted only seconds, but it had changed him in ways he still didn't fully understand. Since that day, he had been able to see things that others couldn't. Shadows that moved independently of their sources, text that appeared on walls when viewed from certain angles, doorways that led to places that shouldn't exist. The second level held chambers where Galileo had once been interrogated, their walls still bearing scorch marks from torches that had burned through long nights of questioning. Here the Church had defended itself against the heresy of scientific inquiry, protecting faithful souls from truths that might shake their devotion. The Inquisition had done its work thoroughly in these chambers, extracting confessions with methods that would have impressed Roman torturers. Iron rings still protruded from the walls, their chains long since rusted away but their purpose clear. Stains on the floor marked places where prisoners had knelt to receive their sentences, some accepting their fate with grace, while others raged against the dying of their light. All had contributed their screams to the acoustic legacy of these chambers, their voices joining a choir that sang songs of suffering across the centuries. But the most disturbing feature of this level was the mirrors. Ancient silvered glass hung in alcoves throughout the interrogation chambers, their surfaces clouded with age but still functional. Alessio had learned to avoid direct eye contact with them after discovering that they sometimes showed reflections of people who weren't there. Figures in medieval robes carrying instruments of torture, faces that belonged to no living person, eyes that tracked movement with malevolent intelligence. The third level contained cells where heretics had been held until their trials or executions. Some bore the scratched final words of men and women who had dared to question doctrine, their fingernails worn to bloody stumps from clawing at stone. Others held drawings that defied explanation, geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed directly, equations that described forces no human should understand, anatomical diagrams of creatures that existed in no bestiary known to natural science. One cell contained what appeared to be a star chart, but the constellations bore no resemblance to any earthly sky. The stars were connected by lines that formed patterns which hurt to contemplate, suggesting relationships between celestial bodies that violated everything known about astronomy. Another held a detailed map of Vatican City that included chambers and passages that existed on no official blueprint, revealing the true extent of the underground complex. A third cell contained thousands of names, written in dozens of languages, some scratched into stone with such force that fingers must have bled from the effort. Alessio had recognized some of the names, historical figures who had supposedly died of natural causes, scientists whose research had been deemed heretical, artists whose works had been banned by the Church. All of them had apparently ended up in these depths, contributing their knowledge to whatever purpose the Vatican truly served. At the fourth level, the architecture changed completely. Roman engineering gave way to something older and more primitive, bearing inscriptions in scripts that predated Christianity itself. The carved stone told stories in languages that had died with their speakers, but the images remained universal: sacrifice, worship, supplication before entities that cared nothing for human prayers or human pain. The reliefs showed processions of robed figures carrying objects that might have been relics or weapons, or something between the two. They approached altars where hooded priests performed rituals that involved more than simple animal sacrifice. The carvings were worn smooth by centuries of touch, suggesting that many people had traced these images with reverent fingers over the years. But the most disturbing aspect of these ancient carvings was their accuracy. Alessio had seen some of the objects depicted in the reliefs during his years of service. They were real, stored in vaults even deeper than this level, waiting for purposes that remained unclear. The artists who had created these images had been working from direct observation, not imagination. Water dripped from stalactites into pools so black they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The liquid was always exactly body temperature, regardless of the season above ground. Chemical analysis had shown it to be ordinary water, but somehow it felt different against the skin, heavier, more viscous, charged with potential energy that made hair stand on end. Strange sounds echoed from sealed passages that branched off the main corridor. Latin chanting rose and fell like breathing, though no living throat could sustain those notes for hours at a time. Scratching sounds suggested claws or fingernails dragging against stone, accompanied by whispers in languages that predated Rome's conquest of the world. Sometimes Alessio heard what sounded like conversation, voices discussing topics in tongues he couldn't identify, but somehow understood on a level deeper than conscious thought. The speakers seemed to be debating matters of cosmic significance, the movement of celestial bodies, the nature of time itself, the proper methods for invoking entities that existed outside normal space-time. His compass spun wildly in this place, its needle unable to find magnetic north. Electronic devices failed without explanation, their circuits overwhelmed by fields that shouldn't exist. Digital watches stopped, their displays going dark despite fully charged batteries. Even mechanical timepieces ran slow, as if time itself moved differently in these depths. Alessio had long suspected that the Vatican's architects had built upon foundations that were never meant to support a Christian church. Something had been here first, something that left its mark in stone and silence. The earliest papal records hinted at it, references to the Old Covenant and that which came before, and the foundation that must not be disturbed. Every pope in history had been briefed about what lay beneath their feet, and every one had chosen to build upward rather than excavate downward. The official explanation was stability concerns, but Alessio knew better. They were afraid of what they might find if they dug too deep. They were deeper now than any official survey had ever recorded, walking corridors that lay 400 feet below ground level. The Vatican's public records showed sub-basements, extending only 50 feet down, space for utilities and storage and nothing more. But Alessio moved through chambers that had been carved from bedrock that had never known sunlight, passages that existed in a realm between the physical and spiritual worlds. The air itself was different here. It carried tastes and scents that belonged to no earthly environment, copper and ozone, sulfur, and something sweeter that might have been incense burned in rituals that predated human civilization. Breathing it produced subtle changes in perception, allowing glimpses of dimensions that normal sight couldn't access. At the deepest point stood the Chamber of Laws, its marble walls bearing 5 rules carved in pristine Latin. The lettering was perfect, each character cut with mathematical precision by tools that had left no trace of their passing. Alessio had memorized these rules long ago, but he read them again now, as he always did before an assignment. They were the foundation upon which his existence rested, the boundaries that kept him sane in a world that had long since abandoned sanity. But tonight, the rules seemed different. The carved letters pulsed with faint phosphorescence, and the words themselves seemed to shift meaning as he read them. For the first time, Alessio wondered who had written these laws, and whether they had been meant to protect him, or to bind him to something far worse than servitude. Nomen tantum, know only the name, never the crime. The executioner was told nothing of what brought the condemned to his blade. Their sins remained between them and God, while Alessio served merely as an instrument of divine will. He had learned not to wonder what horrors might justify such extreme measures, what acts could stain a soul so deeply that death became a mercy. But lately, the names had been bothering him. Cardinals and bishops, respected scholars, and beloved priests, individuals whose public lives showed no trace of heresy or corruption. How could such people require spiritual extermination? What sins could they have committed that ordinary confession couldn't absolve? Ritus ante mortem. Perform the sacred rite without fail. He must whisper the miserere while touching a consecrated bone relic to the condemned skin before the final stroke. The ritual served multiple purposes. It prepared the soul for judgment. It blessed the blade with holy purpose, and it protected the executioner from spiritual contamination. Alessio had performed this rite hundreds of times, the Latin words flowing from his lips like water from a spring, but recently he had begun to notice changes in the ritual's effects. The relic grew warm during the ceremony, sometimes hot enough to burn flesh. The condemned often exhibited strange reactions, speaking in languages they shouldn't know, displaying knowledge of events they couldn't have witnessed, referring to him by names he had never heard before. Porta Lazari. All remains went to the Gate of Lazarus, a sealed ossuary from 1609 where no living soul was permitted to linger. The bones of the executed were not buried in consecrated ground, nor were they burned and scattered. They were taken to a place older than the Vatican itself, where they joined countless others in eternal contemplation of their sins. The ossuary was a place of power that defied easy explanation. Bodies placed there underwent changes that had nothing to do with ordinary decomposition. Bones rearranged themselves into patterns that suggested purpose beyond random decay. Sometimes, late at night, sounds emerged from the sealed chamber, not screaming, but something that might have been singing in harmonies that human voices couldn't produce. Nihil retini, never keep a relic, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The condemned often carried objects of power, amulets, rings, fragments of bone or stone that hummed with otherworldly energy. All of it went to the church's vaults, catalogued and sealed away from prying eyes. The punishment for keeping even the smallest trinket was called inversion, though none had ever explained what that truly meant. Alessio had never been tempted to find out, but lately he had begun to wonder if some of his predecessors had faced that fate. The whispers that echoed through the depths sometimes carried familiar cadences, speech patterns that reminded him of executioners who had served before him. Papa solus in confessione. See the Pope only in confession, never in any other circumstance. Breaking this rule, the marble warned, led to an end worse than fire. Alessio's only contact with the Holy Father came through the ancient sacrament of penance, speaking through a screen that preserved both their anonymities. He confessed his doubts and fears, received absolution for the blood on his hands, and returned to the darkness that was his domain. But the Pope's voice had been changing over the years, taking on qualities that didn't quite sound human. The absolutions came in languages that weren't quite Latin, carrying inflections that made his bones ache with harmonics that existed below the threshold of normal hearing. These 5 rules had governed his life for 11 years, and in all that time he had never broken one of them. They were more than guidelines. They were sacred laws, carved in stone, and sealed with the authority of Christ's representative on earth. To break them was to invite damnation of a sort that made ordinary hell seem like a holiday resort. But as Alessio stared at the rules this morning, reading the phosphorescent text that seemed to writhe with independent life, he felt something he had never experienced before. Doubt, yes, but something deeper. A growing certainty that these rules weren't meant to serve God's will, but something else entirely. His hands trembled as he broke the wax seal. The parchment crackled like autumn leaves as he unfolded it, releasing a scent that reminded him of burned offerings and ancient incense. The name written there made no sense, violated everything he thought he understood about his role and purpose. Cardinal Elia Benatti. The man was beloved worldwide, credited with miraculous healings from Naples to Mexico City. Alessio had seen him on Vatican television, addressing crowds of thousands who hung on his every word. Children threw flower petals at his feet while parents wept with joy at his blessings. The elderly claimed that years of pain vanished at his touch. Cancer patients experienced remissions that defied medical explanation after brief contact with his hands. Cardinal Benatti had survived an assassination attempt in Mexico City that killed 3 bodyguards and wounded a dozen bystanders. Security footage showed the gunman firing 7 shots at point-blank range, each bullet passing within inches of the cardinal's body without making contact. The assassin later claimed he'd been aiming at something else, something that stood beside Benatti, and deflected his aim through means that physics couldn't explain. Medical miracles followed Benatti wherever he travelled. Terminal patients experienced spontaneous remissions that baffled oncologists. The blind saw, describing colours they had never witnessed before. The lame walked, their atrophied muscles somehow restored to full function. The deaf heard angels singing, reporting melodies that recording equipment couldn't capture. The Vatican's Medical Commission had investigated 43 cases over the past 5 years and declared 37 of them genuine miracles lacking any scientific explanation. Skeptics attempted to expose fraud or trickery, but extensive investigation revealed nothing but authentic, supernatural intervention. The faithful travelled thousands of miles just to be in his presence, hoping for divine intervention in their struggles with mortality. How could such a man be condemned to spiritual extermination? Alessio read the parchment 3 times, hoping the words would change or reveal some hidden meaning, but the instruction remained simple and final: before sunset. The rite must be complete. No explanation, no justification, just a name and a deadline, the same format that had preceded every execution for 11 years. But this time felt different. This time, Alessio found himself asking questions that had no answers and challenging assumptions that had governed his entire adult life. He folded the parchment and tucked it into his robes, but his hands continued to shake. In all his years of service, he had executed thieves and heretics, practitioners of dark arts and dealers in forbidden knowledge. Their crimes were invisible to him, but their guilt was assumed based on the infallibility of church judgment. But Cardinal Benatti was different. He was famous, beloved, watched by millions. His disappearance would be noticed immediately, investigated by authorities both secular and religious, mourned by believers worldwide. How could the church risk such scrutiny for a single execution? What crime could justify eliminating one of their most popular and effective ministers? The questions burned in Alessio's mind like acid, eating away at certainties he had never thought to examine. For 11 years, he had served without doubt or hesitation. He had been the perfect instrument, asking nothing and knowing less. But perfection, he was beginning to realize, came at a price higher than he had ever imagined. As the day wore on, Alessio found himself unable to concentrate on his usual preparations. He cleaned and oiled his tools with mechanical precision, but his mind kept returning to the Cardinal's face on television screens, radiating warmth and genuine compassion that seemed to emanate from his very soul. He had seen evil in his time, eyes that reflected nothing but hunger and malice, voices that spoke words designed to corrupt and destroy, presences that seemed to drain warmth and hope from the air around them. Cardinal Benatti possessed none of those qualities. If anything, he seemed to be their opposite, a beacon of light in a world that had grown steadily darker. That evening, as the sun cast long shadows across St. Peter's Square, Alessio made his way through the Apostolic Palace. His Vatican credentials granted him access to areas most cardinals had never seen. corridors that existed on no official blueprints. Security cameras turned away from his passage as if guided by invisible hands, their lenses focusing on empty spaces while he walked past unrecorded. Guards found urgent business elsewhere when he approached their posts, called away by duties that would be forgotten the moment he passed. The church protected its secrets with supernatural efficiency, employing methods that went far beyond ordinary security measures. He moved through the building's hidden arteries like blood through a body, unseen and unquestioned. The palazzo's architecture revealed its age through subtle changes, Renaissance frescoes giving way to medieval stonework, then to Roman brick and mortar that had weathered 2 millennia. The building was a palimpsest written in marble and gold, each generation adding its own layer to the accumulating weight of history. But tonight, Alessio noticed details that had escaped his attention during previous visits. Carved faces in the cornices whose expressions changed when viewed from different angles. Geometric patterns in the floor tiles that formed equations, describing forces that shouldn't exist. Paintings whose subjects seemed to track his movement through peripheral vision, their eyes following his progress with unnatural awareness. Cardinal Benatti's private chambers occupied the 3rd floor of a wing constructed during the reign of Pope Julius II. The rooms were austere by Vatican standards, furnished with simple wooden furniture and threadbare carpets that spoke of a man more concerned with spiritual wealth than material comfort. Books lined every wall, theology and philosophy, but also works on medicine, archaeology, and ancient languages that suggested interests beyond the typical clerical pursuits. The air in the chambers felt different from the rest of the palace. It was warmer, charged with an energy that made the hair on Alessio's arms stand on end. Candles burned without being lit, their flames dancing to rhythms that had nothing to do with air currents. Shadows moved independently of their sources, forming patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. Alessio found the cardinal kneeling before a golden reliquary, deep in prayer. The container was exquisite, crafted by master goldsmiths during the height of the Renaissance. Every surface was covered with intricate engravings depicting scenes from scripture, but the images seemed to move when viewed directly, showing variations of familiar stories that contained details no theologian would recognize. But the reliquary's beauty couldn't disguise the wrongness that radiated from it like heat from a forge. The air around it shimmered with distortion that hurt to perceive directly. The gold itself seemed to pulse with internal light that cast shadows in directions that violated the laws of optics. Whatever the container held, it possessed power that made ordinary relics seem like children's toys. The cardinal's lips moved silently as he prayed, and his face held an expression of profound peace, mixed with terrible sadness. Tears tracked down his cheeks, but these were tears of joy, rather than sorrow. He looked like a man who had found something he had been seeking his entire life, even if that something might destroy him in the process. "Your Eminence," Alessio whispered from the doorway. Cardinal Benatti turned slowly, and his eyes widened in recognition. There was no fear in his gaze, no surprise or anger, only a deep weariness that spoke of burdens carried too long, and a sort of resigned acceptance that chilled Alessio more than any scream or curse might have. "You're him," he said softly, "the shadow that walks beneath the basilica, the instrument of divine wrath." His voice held neither condemnation nor pleading, just a sort of resigned acceptance that made the entire situation feel inevitable. This was a man who had been expecting death, who had perhaps been hoping for it as a release from responsibilities too heavy for mortal shoulders. "I serve the church," Alessio replied, the words automatic after years of repetition. "Do you?" Benatti asked, rising slowly to his feet. "Or do you serve something that merely wears the church's face?" Before Alessio could respond, before he could even process the question's implications, training took over. His hand moved to the small vial concealed in his robes, containing a paralytic agent stolen from the Vatican's medical supplies weeks ago. The chemical was potent enough to incapacitate without causing death, refined through centuries of use by men in his position. But as he prepared to administer the drug, Cardinal Benatti spoke again. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying an authority that bypassed conscious thought and struck directly at something deeper. "Before you complete your assignment, there's something you need to see. Something that will change everything you believe about your role here." Alessio's hand froze halfway to the vial. Every instinct screamed at him to continue, to complete the mission as he had completed dozens before. But something in the Cardinal's voice, some quality of absolute conviction, made him hesitate. "I don't ask questions," he said, repeating the first rule he had learned. "Then you don't know what you're really doing," Benatti replied. "You don't know who you're really serving. You don't know what purpose these executions actually serve." The Cardinal moved to his desk and withdrew a key that seemed to be carved from a single piece of black stone. Its surface was covered with inscriptions in scripts that predated known writing systems, but somehow their meaning was clear to anyone who looked upon them. "This opens a chamber that exists on no map, contains documents that predate the Vatican itself. 5 minutes of your time, executioner. 5 minutes to learn the truth about what you've been doing for 11 years. Alessio found himself nodding before conscious thought could intervene. Something about this situation felt different from all the others, charged with significance that went beyond a simple execution. The Cardinal's certainty was infectious, and the questions that had been plaguing him demanded answers more urgently than ever. They descended through passages that Alessio had never seen before, despite his extensive knowledge of the Vatican's hidden architecture. The stone key opened doors that had been sealed for centuries, revealing chambers whose existence defied architectural logic. They moved through spaces that were larger inside than outside, following corridors that curved in directions that shouldn't exist. The deeper they went, the older everything became. Christian iconography gave way to symbols that predated organized religion, then to markings that might have been carved by hands that weren't entirely human. The air grew thick with age and significance, charged with potential energy that made their skin tingle with static electricity. They reached a chamber that existed in defiance of every law of physics and geometry. The walls curved away into infinity, yet somehow the space felt intimate and confined. Shelves lined every surface, filled with documents that should have crumbled to dust millennia ago, but remained perfectly preserved. "This is the true archive," Cardinal Benatti explained, his voice echoing strangely in the impossible space. "The records that document what the Vatican really is, what purpose it has always served, what destiny it was built to fulfill." He selected a manuscript from a shelf that seemed to extend beyond the reach of normal space. The document was bound in leather that might have been human skin, its pages made from material that wasn't quite parchment. The text was written in multiple languages, some of which had never been spoken by human tongues. "The Church as the world knows it is a mask," Benatti said, opening the manuscript to reveal diagrams that hurt to perceive directly. "Beneath that mask is something far older, far more dangerous, an organization that has spent 2 millennia preparing for the return of entities that ruled this world before humanity existed." The diagrams showed the Vatican as it truly was. Not a center of faith, but a focusing lens for energies that predated human civilization. Every prayer, every donation, every act of devotion funneled power into systems designed by minds that thought in geological timescales. The entire structure was a machine, and every believer was an unwitting component in its operation. "Every pope knows," Benatti continued, turning pages that revealed architectural plans showing the true extent of the underground complex. "They're briefed during their coronation about the real purpose of the Vatican, the true nature of the church they're called to lead. Some resist. They become the popes who die suddenly or abdicate unexpectedly. Others accept their role in the great work, the preparation for humanity's final judgment. Alessio stared at images that showed chambers extending miles beneath the Vatican, filled with machinery that incorporated both mechanical and organic components. The technology was beyond anything human science could produce, suggesting origins that predated terrestrial civilization. "The executioners don't kill sinners," Benatti said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "You kill those who get too close to the truth. Cardinals who read the wrong documents. Priests who perform archaeological excavations in the wrong locations. Scholars who translate texts that should have remained in ancient languages. Anyone who threatens to expose what the church has become." A new manuscript appeared in the cardinal's hands, this one containing lists of names that stretched back centuries. Alessio recognized some of them, historical figures who had supposedly died of natural causes, scientists whose research had been deemed heretical, artists whose works had been banned by the church. All of them had apparently ended up in the depths beneath the Vatican, their knowledge absorbed into the great work. "And when you fail in your duties," Benatti continued, "when you break the rules or ask too many questions, you face inversion. Your soul becomes bound to the depths as an eternal confessor, whispering sins for the damned until the end of time. Those voices you hear echoing through the passages, they're your predecessors, executioners who couldn't quite bring themselves to complete their final assignment." The truth hit Alessio like a physical blow. The whispers that had plagued the depths for as long as he could remember weren't random sounds or acoustic anomalies. They were the voices of men who had stood where he stood now, facing the same terrible choice between obedience and damnation. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you're different," Benatti replied. "Your predecessors discovered the truth too late, after they had already committed acts that bound them to the darkness. But you still have a choice. You can complete your assignment and become another voice in the depths, or you can help me finish what I started." The cardinal produced the bone fragment from his reliquary, and Alessio felt its influence washing over him like a tide of liquid fire. The relic pulsed with power that made the air itself seem thick and substantial, charged with potential that could reshape reality according to will and desire. "This fragment comes from something the scriptures call the Angel of the Abyss," Benatti explained. "A being that will unlock the bottomless pit when the end times come. But the Vatican isn't trying to prevent that apocalypse. They're working to ensure it happens according to their plan." Visions flashed through Alessio's mind, images of rituals performed in chambers, even deeper than this one, of popes kneeling before altars that bore no resemblance to Christian tradition, of ceremonies that invoked entities whose names were carved in stone tablets hidden beneath the Vatican library. He saw the truth of what Cardinal Benatti claimed. The Vatican wasn't serving God. It was serving something that had existed long before the concept of divine love had entered human consciousness. Every prayer offered in every church, every act of faith performed by believers worldwide, fed energy into a system designed to weaken the barriers between worlds. "The faithful believe they're serving God," Benatti said, his black tears flowing faster now. "But their devotion serves purposes that their minds couldn't grasp. We're not preventing revelation, we're orchestrating it, and I can't be part of that anymore." Alessio found himself at a crossroads that would define not just his fate, but the fate of everyone who had ever knelt in prayer. The executioner's sword felt heavier in his hands, weighted with significance that went far beyond its physical mass. "I have a choice," he said finally. "You do," Benatti confirmed, "but choose quickly. The sun is setting, and your superiors will expect confirmation of my death before morning. After that, questions will be asked that neither of us can answer. Alessio raised the ancient blade, its edge catching the impossible light that filled the chamber, but instead of bringing it down on the Cardinal's neck, he found himself making a decision that would change everything. He pressed the sword's tip to his own palm and drew it across the flesh, letting his blood drip onto the bone fragment. The moment the two substances made contact, the world exploded into sensation that transcended normal human experience. The relic burned like a coal from hell's own furnace, but the pain was nothing compared to the visions that flooded his mind. He saw the Vatican as it really was, not a centre of faith but a focusing lens for energies that predated human civilization. Every prayer, every donation, every act of devotion funneled power into systems designed by minds that thought in geological time scales. He saw popes throughout history, kneeling before altars that bore no Christian symbols, performing rituals that invoked entities whose names couldn't be spoken by human tongues. He saw the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, its architects following blueprints that incorporated symbols and measurements that served purposes beyond aesthetics or engineering necessity. He saw generations of faithful believers feeding their devotion into a machine designed to bring about the end of everything they held sacred. Their prayers rose like smoke from countless churches, but instead of reaching heaven, they were captured and channeled through systems that existed in dimensions human geometry couldn't describe. And he saw what would happen when that machine finally achieved its purpose. The visions weren't just images. They were experiences that flooded his nervous system with sensations no human was meant to process. He felt the weight of eons pressing down on his shoulders, the accumulated suffering of countless souls who had died in service to a plan they never understood. He tasted copper and sulfur, heard screams that had been echoing through dimensions for millennia, but he also felt something else, a power that transcended ordinary understanding, a force that could rewrite the fundamental laws of reality if properly channeled. The bone fragment was more than just a relic. It was a key that could unlock doors between worlds, a tool that could reshape existence according to will and desire. The fragment began to merge with his flesh, its ancient material bonding with his cells on a molecular level. The sensation was indescribable, like being struck by lightning while drowning in honey, pain and pleasure so intense they became indistinguishable. His vision blurred, then cleared to reveal spectrums of light that human eyes had never been designed to perceive. Through his enhanced sight, Alessio could see the true nature of the chamber around them. The walls weren't solid stone, but crystalline structures that pulsed with internal energy, their surfaces covered with circuits that channeled power through pathways carved from space-time itself. The impossible geometry wasn't an illusion. The room actually existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, folded through hyperspace in ways that allowed infinite volume within finite boundaries. Cardinal Benatti's form began to dissolve as the relic's influence spread through the chamber. But this wasn't death, it was transformation. His physical substance became translucent, then invisible. But his presence remained stronger than ever. His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carrying harmonics that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. "You understand now," Benatti said, his words rippling through dimensions, like stones dropped in still water. "This isn't about good versus evil, faith versus doubt. It's about the end of one age and the beginning of another. The question is whether humanity will play any role in what comes next." Alessio tried to speak, but found that language had become inadequate for expressing what he now comprehended. The concepts flooding his mind were too vast for words, too complex for linear thought. Instead, he communicated through patterns of meaning that bypassed conscious cognition entirely. The bone fragment had become part of him completely, its influence spreading through his nervous system like a benevolent infection. Through it, he could feel the entire Vatican complex, as if it were an extension of his own body. every chamber, every passage, every hidden room filled with artifacts that defied explanation. All of it now responded to his will. But more than that, he could sense the network of similar sites around the world. Ancient temples built on convergence points where reality grew thin. Cathedrals whose true purpose had been hidden beneath layers of religious tradition. Modern buildings whose architects had unknowingly followed plans that served purposes they couldn't imagine. All of it connected, all of it part of a single vast organism that had been growing for millennia. The Vatican was just the nerve center, the focal point where energies from around the globe were collected and refined. And now, for the first time in its history, that organism had achieved something approaching consciousness. The transformation is accelerating, Benatti observed, his voice carrying notes of both triumph and terror. You've become the final component, the bridge that will allow the great work to reach completion, but there's still time to choose how that completion unfolds. Alessio felt the weight of choice settling around him like gravity itself. The power flowing through the relic offered possibilities that staggered the imagination. He could reshape reality according to his will, remake the world in any form he desired. He could prevent the apocalypse the Vatican had been orchestrating, or he could guide it toward purposes that served humanity rather than the entities waiting in cosmic darkness. But he could also choose to complete his original mission, to serve the forces that had shaped his entire existence, to become the instrument through which ancient powers finally achieved their goals. The choice was his, but the consequences would affect every living thing on Earth. The chamber around them began to change as the relic's influence spread beyond its original boundaries. Walls shifted and flowed like liquid stone, revealing passages that led to places that existed outside normal space-time. The impossible geometry became even more complex, creating architectural forms that described mathematical relationships governing forces beyond physical law. From the depths of these new passages came sounds that had no earthly origin. Not quite music, not quite language, but something between the two that conveyed meaning through harmonic frequencies that resonated in dimensions human senses couldn't access. The sounds spoke of preparation, of anticipation, of something vast and ancient, stirring after eons of slumber. "They know," Benatti said, his form now completely invisible, but his presence stronger than ever. "The entities that have waited so long for this moment can feel the change beginning. They're waking up, preparing to reclaim a world they ruled before humanity existed." Alessio could sense them now. Consciousness is so alien that contact with them threatened to shatter his sanity, despite the protection offered by his transformation. They existed in spaces between dimensions, patient beyond human comprehension, waiting for the barriers between worlds to weaken enough to allow their return. Some were vast beyond description, their thoughts moving like continental drift across time periods that dwarfed human history. Others were smaller, but more active, their attention focused on the immediate task of breaking through into physical reality. All of them were ancient beyond measure, and all of them regarded humanity as little more than a useful tool for achieving their purposes. But they weren't inherently evil, Alessio realized. They were simply so far beyond human understanding that their goals and methods couldn't be judged by moral standards that applied to terrestrial existence. They were forces of nature on a cosmic scale, as indifferent to human suffering as earthquakes or storms. The real question was whether humanity could find a way to coexist with such entities, or whether the very attempt would result in the extinction of everything recognizably human. The Vatican has been working toward complete submission, Benatti explained, his voice now coming from the walls themselves. Their plan calls for humanity to serve as willing slaves, providing worship and energy in exchange for being allowed to continue existing. But there are other possibilities. Through the relic's influence, Alessio began to perceive those alternatives. Humanity could negotiate from a position of strength, offering partnership rather than servitude. The entities needed what humans could provide: emotional energy, creative thought, the spark of consciousness that allowed abstract concepts to take physical form. But that need could become leverage if properly exploited. Or humanity could choose to resist entirely, using the same forces the Vatican had harnessed to seal the barriers between worlds permanently. The cost would be enormous: the destruction of everything that made civilization possible, the reduction of human existence to its most primitive forms. But it would preserve independence at the price of progress. The third option was the most radical of all. Humanity could choose to transcend its current limitations entirely, using the cosmic forces at play to evolve beyond recognition. The process would be traumatic, requiring the death of everything familiar about human existence. But what emerged might be capable of meeting the ancient entities as equals, rather than servants or enemies. Each choice carried consequences that stretched across geological timescales. The decision made in this chamber would determine not just the fate of current humanity, but the ultimate destiny of consciousness in the universe. Alessio felt the weight of that responsibility crushing down upon him, but also the exhilaration of power sufficient to reshape reality itself. Through the relic, he could sense the entire planet as a single organism, its cities and nations, nothing more than specialized organs serving functions that most inhabitants couldn't perceive. The Vatican's influence extended far beyond what anyone imagined. Every major religion contained elements that fed energy into the same system, their apparent differences masking fundamental unity of purpose. Every government had been subtly influenced by policies that weakened resistance to cosmic intervention. Every technological advancement had been guided toward creating infrastructure that could channel forces from beyond normal space-time. All of it building towards this moment, when the accumulated faith and devotion of billions would finally provide sufficient energy to rip open the barriers between worlds. The apocalypse wasn't a future event to be prevented or delayed. It was happening now, in this chamber, through his choices and actions. "Choose quickly," Benatti urged, his voice carrying undertones of urgency that bypassed conscious thought. "The sun is set above, and your superiors are beginning to wonder why you haven't reported success. Soon they'll send others to investigate and the opportunity will be lost." Alessio raised his hands and watched light pour from his fingertips, energy that had never existed in normal space-time, flowing through channels carved from his own transformed nervous system. The power was intoxicating, offering godlike capabilities to anyone strong enough to channel it properly. But with that power came responsibility that dwarfed anything he had ever imagined. The fate of not just humanity, but consciousness itself, hung in the balance, waiting for him to choose between paths that led to radically different futures. He thought of the billions of believers who had unknowingly contributed their faith to this moment, trusting in institutions they believed served divine purposes. They deserved to know the truth about what their devotion had accomplished, to have some voice in determining what came next. He thought of the generations of executioners who had served before him, trapped in cycles of violence they couldn't escape, because they had never been given the information necessary to make informed choices. Their whispers still echoed through the depths, carrying warnings that might have prevented this moment if anyone had been listening. And he thought of the entities waiting in cosmic darkness, ancient beyond measure but not necessarily hostile. Perhaps there was a way to work with them, rather than serving them, to find common ground between beings separated by billions of years of evolution. The decision crystallized in his mind with absolute clarity. Alessio pressed both hands against the walls of the chamber and opened himself completely to the relic's influence. Power flowed through him like molten gold, reshaping his physical form and expanding his consciousness beyond the boundaries of individual existence. For a moment that felt like eternity, He became one with the vast network that connected every sacred site on earth. Through that connection, he spoke to every believer simultaneously, not in words, but in understanding that bypassed language entirely. He showed them the truth about what their faith had accomplished, the reality behind the institutions they had trusted. He gave them the choice their leaders had denied them for millennia. Some recoiled in horror, their faith shattered by revelations too terrible to accept. Others embraced the truth with joy, finally understanding the cosmic significance of their devotion. Most fell somewhere between, struggling to process information that challenged everything they had believed about the nature of reality. But all of them heard his message. The future was theirs to choose, not something to be decided by ancient entities or hidden hierarchies. Humanity would face the coming transformation as a unified species, aware of the stakes and capable of making informed decisions about its destiny. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Prayers rose from every continent, but these weren't the mindless supplications that had fed the Vatican's machine for centuries. These were conscious choices, deliberate decisions about what kind of future humanity wanted to create. The cosmic entities steering in their dimensional prisons felt the change and responded with something that might have been surprise. For the first time in their existence, they were being contacted by beings who understood what they represented and chose to communicate as equals rather than servants. Negotiations began on levels of reality that human language couldn't describe, conducted through exchanges of pure meaning that transcended the limitations of linear time. Ancient powers offered knowledge and capabilities beyond imagination in return for partnership, rather than worship. Humanity's response was cautious but interested, aware of the risks but intrigued by the possibilities. The transformation of the Vatican began immediately. Walls that had stood for centuries cracked and reformed, revealing their true nature as crystalline structures designed to channel cosmic energies. The artwork and architecture that had defined Catholic tradition dissolved like morning mist, replaced by forms that reflected the building's actual purpose. Pope and cardinals throughout the complex found themselves changed as well. Their consciousness expanded to encompass truths they had only glimpsed in their darkest moments. Some fled in terror, unable to accept what they had become part of. Others embraced their new understanding, finally comprehending the real significance of their roles. But most striking of all was the silence. For the first time in 15 centuries, the whispers from the depths stopped echoing through the passages. The souls of failed executioners had finally found peace, released from their eternal torment by the truth that had eluded them in life. Alessio emerged from the transformed chamber as something unprecedented in human history, a being capable of existing simultaneously in multiple dimensions, bridging the gap between terrestrial consciousness and cosmic awareness. He was still recognizably human, but enhanced beyond normal limitations. The journey back to the surface revealed the full extent of the changes taking place. Every level of the underground complex was transforming, ancient machinery awakening after millennia of dormancy. The Vatican was becoming what it had always been designed to be. Not a center of religious authority, but a communication hub linking Earth with forces that operated on galactic scales. Dawn was breaking over Vatican City as Alessio reached the surface, but the sky was different now. Auroras danced at latitudes where they had never appeared before, their colors shifting through spectrums that human eyes had never perceived. The air itself felt charged with potential, crackling with energies that made every breath an act of communion with cosmic forces. In St. Peter's Square, the morning crowds had gathered as usual, but their behavior was unlike anything seen in the Vatican's history. Instead of the quiet reverence that normally characterized such gatherings, the pilgrims were engaged in animated discussions about visions they had received during the night. Everyone had experienced the same revelation, The truth about the Church's real purpose, the nature of the entities it served, the choice that now faced all of humanity. Some were terrified, others exhilarated, but none could deny what they had witnessed. The Swiss guards stood at their posts with expressions of wonder, rather than their usual stoic professionalism. They had been transformed along with everyone else, their understanding expanded to encompass realities that would have driven them mad hours earlier. Their weapons remained at their sides, but their purpose had fundamentally changed. They were no longer protecting secrets from the faithful. They were helping to facilitate humanity's first conscious contact with cosmic consciousness. A young guard approached Alessio with something that might have been a manuscript, but the document seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. When touched, it didn't convey information through written words, but through direct transfer of understanding that bypassed language entirely. The message was simple but profound. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Humanity had chosen to face the future with full knowledge of what was at stake, but that choice came with responsibilities that would challenge every assumption about the nature of existence. Alessio looked up at the Apostolic Palace, its familiar facade now revealing architectural elements that had been hidden for centuries. The building pulsed with internal light that spoke of energies flowing through channels carved from space-time itself. What had once been the seat of earthly religious authority was becoming something unprecedented, an embassy between worlds, a place where beings separated by billions of years of evolution could find common ground. His reflection in nearby windows showed eyes that wept tears of liquid starlight, evidence of changes that went far beyond the physical. The bone fragment had become part of him so completely that distinguishing between his original nature and its influence was no longer possible. He was human, and more than human, terrestrial and cosmic, individual and collective consciousness, merged into something entirely new. The ancient role of executioner had ended with the breaking of the rules that had governed it for centuries. In its place had emerged something unprecedented, a bridge between species, a translator capable of helping humanity navigate relationships with entities whose thoughts moved like galaxies across time. Behind him, from the depths that had once echoed with the whispers of the damned, came new sounds. Not screaming or lamentation, but music of a complexity that human composers had never imagined. The souls that had been trapped in eternal confession were now free to sing praises to forces they finally understood, their voices joining a choir that stretched across dimensions. As the bells of St. Peter's began to ring with frequencies that touched realities beyond the physical world, Alessio smiled and prepared to begin work that would reshape the relationship between Earth and cosmos. The old church was dying, but from its transformation was emerging something that had never existed before, a conscious partnership between humanity and the forces that governed existence itself. The execution of the old world was complete. The birth of the new one was about to begin. In the years that followed, historians would struggle to explain what had happened during those crucial hours when everything changed. They would speak of mass hallucinations, of psychological contagion, of anything that might provide rational explanation for the impossible. But those who had lived through the transformation knew better. They had experienced something that transcended ordinary reality, participated in the birth of a new age where the boundaries between the physical and metaphysical had been permanently altered. Humanity had faced its greatest test and emerged not unscathed, but transformed. The price had been the loss of comfortable illusions about the nature of existence. The reward was partnership with forces that offered capabilities beyond imagination. The Vatican remained, but as something entirely new, not a centre of earthly religion, but a beacon connecting the earth with consciousness that operated on cosmic scales. And at its heart stood the one who had been the Pope's executioner, now serving as humanity's first ambassador to infinity itself. Some called it the end of the world. Others recognized it as the beginning of everything that truly mattered. The choice had been made, the rules had been broken, and nothing would ever be the same again.